you miss me? I've been out of it comatose, but the depression is
Hello and welcome to Controlled Burns, the new hobby list podcast hosted by me, SlowBurne from Wildfire Gaming. Now, I've got something a little bit different planned for this week, but it is something that I think falls into the podcast's pedigree of listing that I think has the potential to be very interesting and potentially a little controversial for those of you who may or may not be interested in politics, because today I am going to be ranking what I believe to be the top 10 reasons why Kamala Harris lost the 2024 presidential election to Donald Trump. You can listen to the show on all major podcasting networks, including Spotify, Apple, Amazon, and YouTube. And you can write into Controlled Burns with an ES at gmail.com. So I want to talk a little bit about why I decided to, do something pretty significantly different here and record this episode talking about this election. Um, a part of that is just it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And now that I have a podcast, I have a medium that I can use to get things off my chest. And there's a lot of reasons that people are throwing around for why Kamala Harris lost this campaign. And I wanted to, I love lists. And I think a lot of the analysis that I've seen is wrong, or at least I strongly disagree with it. And I wanted to sort of share my opinion and put together a list. And nothing makes me want to do a list more than seeing other lists that I disagree with. So that is kind of how I got started on this, and I've been thinking about it for the last week or so. And we've had some time to sort of digest what happened. It's November 17th as I record this, and it was November 6th, so 11 days ago that the election happened. So I think we've had enough time to at least sort of marinate and think about the results of the election and think about why we got the result that we did. Um, Now, just a little bit of background on me as well, why I'm interested in this kind of thing. I followed politics for a pretty young age. I'm 30 years old now. I would say I started following politics from say late middle school onward. I was, and really, I mean, I was kind of, let's see, I sort of associated, I guess, with the Democratic Party before even that, just because of sort of my upbringing. So I was kind of wired to be more politically involved from a young age because while I grew up in rural Northeast Texas, which is an extremely conservative and frankly undereducated area, I came from a family of liberals. So in order to, I guess, understand why my family thought differently than pretty much everyone else around them, I had to ask questions and investigate and learn and just try to get to the bottom of why we were different. And it's perhaps no coincidence that all this was happening. In particular, I think it really kind of hit a pretty big pitch when Barack Obama was embarking on his meteoric rise to the presidency, and all the hope and optimism that came along with that. I'll never forget the morning after his election in 2008, hearing my mom, who was a disenchanted elementary school teacher in Texas after 8 years of Bush, and really had been more than that because he was the governor of Texas before he was the president. Um, I remember she said, I might actually say the Pledge of Allegiance this morning at school. And it really did feel like a monumental moment. And for me, being a Democrat was so big a part of my identity in high school, because I didn't really hide it, and obviously I was at odds with most of my peers. I actually put Obama 44, because he was the 44th president, on one side of my class ring in high school. I was that bought in, and it was that big a part of my identity. And of course, we now have the benefit of hindsight to recognize that while Obama's presidency did have its bright spots, like the Affordable Care Act and the legalization of gay marriage, much of it was either small incremental change around the margins, or solid work that was either obstructed or overturned by Republicans and Trump. I think a good example is like the Iran nuclear deal. Like really, that immediately comes to mind. Um, and then, frankly, there were steps in the wrong direction as well. I think there was obviously the continued spike in income disparity between the top 1% and the rest of us. And that was particularly, I guess, notable or obvious when Obama, quite frankly, sickeningly bailed out the big banks that were responsible for the subprime mortgage crisis for housing. So, at the end of the day, while he was extremely charismatic, Obama was basically a corporate Democrat who was under the thumb of millionaires and giant corporations. And people didn't like that. And they decided to vote for something different and Donald Trump in 2016, which was a move that, it kind of felt like voters throwing a Molotov cocktail through the establishment and just waiting to watch it burn eagerly, and in a lot of ways it did. Trump backed out of the Iran nuclear deal, which is all the more relevant today as the US backed disaster in the Middle East rages on, which is buying us enemies by the millions in that part of the world. Um, Obviously, he gave another massive tax break to his rich crony friends. He attempted Thankfully, he failed, but he did attempt to overturn the Affordable Care Act, and he also tried to destroy America's progress on transitioning its energy fleet to cheaper and cleaner. I want to reiterate that again: cheaper and cleaner renewable energy, because renewable energy is in fact cheaper. I report on this daily. I know these things. And then, of course, he completely bungled his response to COVID, in which millions of Americans died, and basically set the stage for an economic tailspin that resulted in the massive inflation we saw under the Biden years. So he did all that. He also lied about the result of the 2020 election. He tried miserably to overturn it, committing multiple felonies in the process, and was even stupid enough to commit other crimes, brazen crimes, like needlessly stealing classified documents. So I think it's safe to say in any other era, after such a disastrous first term and then what followed that first term, uh, I think Trump would have failed miserably in his attempt to win the 2024 election. But we aren't in any other era. We're in an era where people are fed up and even disgusted with the direction this country is taking for a variety of reasons. And as a result, allegiances are changing. And, in 2024, while Trump still lost with minorities, he gained with them astronomically, despite his divisive rhetoric, and energized his base while he did so. He also extended his lead among white voters, which is a trend I've seen firsthand. I remember my mom, who was so excited by Barack Obama's ascendancy to the presidency in 2008. Well, as far as I know, she voted for Trump in this election. Things have changed in this electorate big time. And to understand why we must look at a number of why this is happening, we have to look at a number of factors playing into the election and analyze Trump's opponent, Kamala Harris, who kind of haphazardly threw together a campaign in just over 100 days and what was ultimately the Democrats' biggest loss in at least the last 20 years. So, to analyze what happened, I've put together a list of what I think are the top 10 factors that I think caused Trump to win and critically Kamala Harris to lose. Obviously, I don't claim to have all the answers here, but my list is based on what I'm reading, what I'm taking in, the information I'm taking in, what I'm hearing, and my analysis of all the factors leading into and coming out of this election. Now, whether you agree or disagree with this list, I think it is critical that we, on the left in particular, think about what happened here and what can be done to engender a different outcome in the future. Now, for the list, I think all of these were contributing factors. Generally, I did try to put them in order from least to most significant, so they should become greater issues for the electorate as a whole as we go into it. Now, um, this isn't necessarily how I would rank the top 10 issues, like the top 10 issues as it mattered to me. In particular, we're going to have one fairly early on that I think was in some ways my number one issue for this election. But I think this is just, I'm trying to gauge the American electorate as a whole and what I think was the most significant for the outcome, more so than what was significant for me. So trying to sort of remove my own biases here as best as I can. Obviously, it's not possible to completely do that, but I'm going to do my best. But before we get into the top 10, I do want to address one honorable mention or perhaps a dishonorable mention that I think it might have had some impact, but I don't think it had as big an impact as many liberals would like you to believe, and that is issues related to racism and sexism and, quote unquote anti-wokeism. Um, so I want to kind of get these red herrings out of the way. Um, is racism and sexism a part of this country? To take a page from Cenk Uygur here, of course, it's been embedded in the fabric of the country from the very beginning. But I do think there's kind of a cognitive dissonance going on among those that are sort of just putting all of the blame uh, on these factors for Harris loss. Um, I mean, if you just take a step back and think about it, like, do you really think the racist crowd and the sexist crowd were gonna vote for Joe Biden or whatever other Democrat could have emerged if the Democrats had held an actual primary in 2024? Or do you think that their votes were already pretty well sewn up for Donald Trump? For me, I think the answer is pretty clear on that. And let's not forget, Trump did broaden his support with minorities, while Harris hemorrhaged those votes by the million. So I really don't think that like the race issue was a big factor here. And another thing that kind of leads me to believe this as well is these are not the issues that the Harris campaign was running on. I mean, she wasn't advocating for trans rights, or commanding people to vote for her because she's a woman like Hillary Clinton did in 2016. Uh, I think she very clearly made a point not to play the race and the sex card. And honestly, I thought that was a pretty great strategy and one of the strongest points of her campaign. But I can't understand why some people would feel that these issues were what won the day for Trump. For one, because that is what the media has parroted consistently, and it's part of the reason that I wanted to make this list of the reasons that I believe were the biggest contributing factors for Harris's loss. And also, I mean, frankly, racism and division and anti-wokeism is basically what Donald Trump ran his campaign on. But my hypothesis is that people voted for him not because of those issues, but in spite of them. And we're going to get into a little bit of why I think that here and as we move through this list. But to put it bluntly, I don't believe the majority of the American electorate is too racist or too sexist to vote for a black woman for president. I just don't believe that. I don't believe the majority of Americans believe in stripping away women's rights or LGBTQ rights. And there's evidence to suggest that I'm right. I mean, there's ample polling on these issues, and even on election night, you saw the results of many ballot measures across the country where people were voting in favor of abortion rights, even in red states. So yeah, I think there are some. While obviously racism and sexism and the anti-wokeism stuff is a part of the election, I really think there were other factors that ultimately were what swung it in Trump's favor. And I'd like to get into them now with number 10, which I'm calling Kamala Harris's lack of convictions. I think Americans found it hard to support Kamala Harris because I don't think they understood what her convictions and like her firmly held beliefs were. And I think that's understandable because I'm not sure that Kamala Harris has convictions. I'll never forget this quote from her. It was during the 20 or early on in the 2020 primary campaign. I think it was before the debates, but it was like during a town hall. They were all kind of doing these town halls on various networks. And I remember they asked her, whoever it was that was moderating it, asked her like what she was thinking on healthcare. She said, well, I believe this very strongly. We need Medicare for all. I remember that like it was yesterday. It was obviously she was just brazenly copying Bernie Sanders' overwhelmingly popular proposal for universal health care in America. And it wasn't just her. A lot of basically the entire field did. Um, but if she believed in that issue so strongly as she claims, why didn't she discuss it during the 2024 campaign? And in fact, she said during the campaign that she no longer supports that policy with no explanation whatsoever. If she really believed that very strongly, like she said, why would she have changed course so quickly in just 4 years? Here's another example. Um, Harris is like one standout debate moment in the 2020 primary, other than when she got like completely dressed down by another famous grifter named Tulsi Gabbard, was her strong like condemnation of Biden's past opposition to desegregation busing, which is like where they would bus black children to white schools. This is during the civil rights era, like after desegregation was outlawed. And she was just like she really went after him on that. I remember this like it was yesterday as well. Like she like really hammered him on it. She was just like so offended that he would have been against that. And yet there she was, happily accepting his invitation to run with him as vice president, totally sweeping her disdain for his past under the rug, just like over the course of a few months. Um, and then I think this kind of came back during this campaign as well, when she like happily took the reins from him, right? He was exiting the race basically exclusively because of concerns regarding his clear cognitive decline. Um, but she never admitted beforehand that he was experiencing cognitive decline. Never, and even after the where it was so obvious, and he dropped out of the campaign, she never addressed it. Didn't admit that it was affecting his job performance, and people just there's just an obvious dissonance there that I think people were just obviously, it's kind of like ignoring the elephant in the room, right? And it just doesn't work. People know the elephant's there. They want to talk about it, and she just didn't. And I think that was a mistake. Um, you can say what you want about Donald Trump, but I don't think too many people doubt that. For the most part, that guy is saying what he means, you know. And even when he doesn't, like for example, like he's right now he's tolerating the annoying presence of Elon Musk, right? But he does a good job of like pretending that he says what he means. And it's enough at least for him to trick his own base. But there was no tricking us with Kamala Harris. I think she lacked the courage of convictions, and it came back to bite her in a big way in this election. And number 9 here is Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's response to the genocide that Israel is currently taking part in as they try to eradicate the Palestinian people in Gaza. Now, my listing of this issue this low is going to be controversial to any young voter listening to this, or Arab American listening to this, because for them, I think this was their number one issue, and frankly, it was my number one issue as well. I actually questioned whether I could go through with supporting Harris in this campaign, um, when she made no real attempt to hide the fact that she would continue Biden's moral failure of funding the right wing government of Israel's genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza. And for those who don't feel comfortable about my use of that word, here is the literal definition of genocide. It is a noun, and it is the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. So with that definition in mind, what has Israel's routine bombing of schools and hospitals and infrastructure in Gaza been, if not a genocide? You can see the pictures for yourself. Like you can see the before and after. We're talking about in over the course of 1 year. Look at the scale of destruction that has taken place, and is what is just a tiny sliver of land with an unbelievable number of people living in it. What would you call it if you don't call it genocide? Well, what would you call cutting off food and water and even humanitarian aid from other nations, including the United States, to, provide food and water for starving and injured civilians? Many of the leaders in Israel have not been coy about this. They've openly called for the eradication of all Palestinians and argued that no Palestinian civilian is innocent. And they basically just don't look at them any differently than those terrorists that carried out that attack on October 2023. And I think that Israel's invasion of Palestine, well, uh, Gaza in particular, it certainly draws some similarities to the US's own invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s. Our leaders also used a horrific terrorist attack to capitalize on the opportunity to, you know, kill people that really weren't responsible for, you know what I mean? I mean, I obviously we eventually got Osama bin Laden in 2011, but um we didn't kill him for 10 years. We were killing a bunch of other people in these places, particularly in Iraq, where there was no correlation to 9/11 whatsoever. But hey, they all look the same, right? So who cares? Um, Now I often see liberals kind of running to Biden and Kamala's defense on this issue. Their biggest claim is that Trump is going to be even worse, and they're probably right. But do you think it mattered which warmonger was in charge of the Palestinian children burning alive in their hospital beds? Uh, I don't. But it did matter to many historic Democratic voters, and like I said, particularly young voters and Arab Americans who left the party in droves in this election, and frankly, rightly so. So hard to move on from that. But number 8, sort of falling in line with it, is campaigning with war criminals and attempting to capture Republican voters. So ever since Obama, and really even before that, you could stretch all the way back to Hillary to Bill Clinton in the 90s, but Democrats have been doing everything they can to run as basically a second Republican Party. But here's the problem with that strategy. Um, America already has a Republican Party, and every Republican that I know wants the Republican Party in power. And they would rather just vote for the real thing rather than voting for a watered down version of it. Meanwhile, Democrats are hemorrhaging their own base by millions. I mean, Harris is on pace to receive, I think it's somewhere between 10 and 12 million less votes than Biden did in 2020. And that is just a unbelievable collapse of a voter base, which, again, I don't think you can attribute that to racism and sexism. These are people that voted for Joe Biden that are not supporting Kamala Harris. Um, During this campaign, you can look at some of the right wing sort of issues and talking points that Democrats ran on. Now, not all of these were attributable to Kamala Harris. Some of them are, but they were attributable to various races across the country. I heard Democrats, um, really running on ramping up border enforcement. Even Democrats that don't live on the border, like we do down here in Texas. I saw them like up in the north running on border enforcement. There was a lot of running against efforts to, against the defund the police movement that was very big in the wake of the George Floyd protests. I remember Kamala Harris saying that she wanted to make the U.S. military the most elite fighting force in the world, as if she wasn't already, and like toting her gun ownership, saying that she would shoot an invader if they came into her house. I remember here in Texas, Ted Cruz was running so hard, like you could not watch a football game without seeing like two or three ads per break of Ted Cruz talking about how awful it was that transgender kids were playing in sports or whatever. And I remember like even Colin Allred, his opponent, like put out a ad that was like, I'm against boys playing in girls sports, like just totally giving into the that right wing framing and talking points. But if those issues are important to you, if you you want somebody who's a gun toting, uh, queer hating, police loving, you know, border enforcing military, if those are the things that you want, don't you think you're more likely to vote for the party that has been running on those issues for decades instead of these Johnny come latelys pivoting to that position in like the last 4 years? Evidently, the answer is yes. Meanwhile, where does that leave your own base? What about the ones who were the ones that put you in power that did not do not support those things? Well, that's not going to encourage them to go to the polling booth, and we're seeing that now. Here's a really good example of just like how unbelievably idiotic this strategy is. With about a month left to go before Election Day, after touting this endorsement from Liz Cheney, who was a Republican that was basically so hated by her own party that she was basically kicked out of it, Kamala Harris actually had the gall to thank Dick Cheney, her father, for his service to our country. That's what she called it. So, for those of you who may not be old enough to remember, this is the same Dick Cheney who lied about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which is what pushed the US to start what ended up being a completely needless war that resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. And it was basically just so that the US could get its hands on some more oil, you know, keep gas prices a little bit lower the next few years. Well, the American people weren't buying it. And by the time he left office, Dick Cheney's approval rating was, I had to look this up to be sure that this is true. His approval rating when he left office, 13%. Think about like Biden, right? Who's so inept that he had to leave the election months before a vote was even cast. His approval rating hovers in the upper 30s and even low 40s at times. Donald Trump, who has been one of the most divisive presidents of all time, I think at the lowest point in his first term, he bottomed out in like the mid 30s. Think about how much people in your life hate either Biden or Trump, right? They're both despised. Now think about almost everybody in the country feeling how that way. That's how unpopular Dick Cheney was. And yet there was Kamala Harris locking arms with his daughter and thanking him for his service as an effort to reach out to moderate Republicans when there was scarcely a Republican who supported him in his prime. And it's unbelievable, but the results of the election, actually more Republicans voted for Biden than they did for Harris after all that work that she put in to try to court these moderate Republicans, quote unquote. She got less than Biden did. It was a complete failure of her campaign. Meanwhile, she hemorrhaged, like I said, tens of millions. Well, not tens of millions, but 10 million Democratic votes. Disastrous, disastrous decision. And we're only at number 8. Let's move on. So number 7 here, I think this mistake was kind of combined two things here in a bit, but I think they go hand in hand, which is the use of the Biden campaign staffers of the Harris campaign and what I would call the muzzling of Tim Walz, uh, who obviously she chose as her running mate. And I think maybe the single best move, certainly my favorite move of the Kamala Harris campaign was her selection of Tim Walz as her running mate. I remember waking up that day to that news and just being so excited and like optimistic for the future of this country, which I hadn't felt that way since at least 2020, and realistically probably even before that. Um, Tim Walz, he's just a guy who was he was personable, he was charismatic, he was articulate, and he was entertaining, which I think is important, frankly, to the American electorate. Maybe it shouldn't be, but I think it is. And he had the record in Minnesota to back it up. I wrote down a few of his accomplishments here, but he had many more than this. But some of his accomplishments in Minnesota, and mind you, he did all of this with a 1-seat majority in the Minnesota legislature. He implemented universal free school meals for children. He implemented tax rebates for families that bring in less than $150,000 a year. He implemented 12 weeks paid sick and family leave. He implemented red flag laws and universal background checks for gun purchases. Automatic voter registration. I mean, I live here in Texas. It is the voter registration process, even if you just move, is such a pain in the ass. Like I guarantee that more people would vote if it was just simpler to do, which is such a great idea from Tim Walz there in Minnesota. And he even implemented free college for children, but this, it's only for families making less than $80,000 per year. But it's great that you incentivize the poorest families, and give their kids an opportunity at a higher education without putting them in debt for the rest of their life. And he mandated the state to reach carbon-free electricity by 2040, which of course is what I cover the most in my daily reporting at New Project Media. And I was, because of that, I was aware of him before Kamala Harris chose him, and that's why I was part of why I was so excited that was her choice. He was so obviously the best choice out of everybody that was kind of being floated as an option for her. So yeah, that's a record that people can get behind, and things were looking up. Walz was calling Trump and the Republicans weird, and he was, taking off like wildfire and energizing the base. Like I haven't seen the base energized since the Obama years, and then it stopped. Walz stopped making TV appearances. The Democrats stopped with the weird messaging, and Kamala Harris started running with the Cheneys instead of her actual running mate. And I think, based on evidence that we've seen, the culprit was the Biden campaign staffers. So there was this leaked document where somebody from the Biden campaign, I can't remember who it was, but there was this document where basically he was giving advice to the Harris campaign. And his two biggest pieces of advice were stop with all the weird talk. It's too negative. And don't say we are not going back, which was kind of Harris's slogan, which I thought was actually pretty good. I think that kind of sums up how I felt. And I think a lot of people felt like, yeah, we're not going back to Trump. We need to move forward. And then they replaced that with turn the page, whatever that means. You're going to fucking library or something. And then just like that, Harris stunted all of her momentum. She started campaigning with war criminals, and you can see the graphs if you go back and look at them. It's right when that shift in the campaign happened. That's right whenever she started dropping in the polls. She was consistently beating Trump by an average of 5%. That dropped down to less than 2%. And it's like clockwork. Like I said, look it up. It's this podcast's not visual, so I can't show you like on your screen or anything, but it's very clear as day, and very easy to see in the polls there. So this was a failure of Harris because she should have had the political wherewithal to recognize that the Biden campaign was losing and that she should do something different than what they were doing, but she didn't, and she lost. Now, number 6, I think, is what I'm going to call poor communication on economic policy proposals from Kamala Harris. Now, here's a little bit of positivity for her. I think she did have some pretty strong policy proposals. She supported bringing down housing costs through a combination of raising the supply while providing assistance to families buying their first homes. That was pretty strong, I think, idea to hit from both sides there. She supported raising the child tax credit to $6,000, and she supported outlawing corporate price gouging, which led to the record explosion in grocery prices that we saw over the last couple of years. I mean, these CEOs have not been shy about this. It was Kroger's senior director for pricing. His name is Andy Groth. He admitted in August that the store raised the prices of eggs and milk beyond inflation levels, and that fact was obvious because the next month you could see that the store was reporting massive profits in their earnings call. Isn't it funny how when people had finally had enough of how expensive fast food prices were, for instance, now all these fast food companies are suddenly offering these meal deals to try to get these customers to come back. Like, why weren't they just offering those prices to begin with? It's because of greed and inflation. But it's greed that's driving the inflation. It's not real. The inflation is a real thing, but it doesn't inflate by what we've seen over the last few years. That's not normal. That's greed. That's corporate greed. And they're trying to pass that down to the American people. And luckily the American people isn't buying it for stuff that they can't that they can give up, like fast food. But when it comes to milk and eggs and like these necessities that you have to have that are basic groceries, they just kind of had to suck it up and pay them. And you had Kroger laughing all the way to the bank and many of the other grocers as well. And Kamala Harris did have policies that would have changed these things, and she should have been parroting those policies every single day. Remember how Bernie Sanders did that? You couldn't put that man anywhere near a microphone without him saying, America needs universal health care like every other major country on earth. We need to overturn the disastrous Supreme Court ruling of Citizens United. We need to have a living wage. I'm fighting for you and not the corporations and billionaires and Wall Street. You can like it's so easy to you just slip right back into his diction because he said it so many times. It's like wired into my brain, and it worked. There's not a person in this country that was politically aware in any sense in 2016 that didn't know Bernie Sanders supported Medicare for all and a $15 minimum wage. Maybe not everybody agreed with it, but they all knew that those were his positions. But with Harris, polling indicated that voters were like much less sure of what her policies were. And I even saw reporting claiming that she didn't have any policies. And, the only way to combat um, messaging like that is to harp on your policies over and over and over again. You got to drill it into people's skulls what your policies actually are and what you're fighting for. And you have to explain to the average voter why that's going to make their lives better. But she didn't do that. She ducked interviews and she campaigned with the Cheneys, and we see the result. All right, number five. I'm calling this misinformation echo chambers. So this is I think the biggest thing that resulted in the Harris loss that she could not control. And that is just the rampant misinformation bubbles that conservatives put themselves into. Now, to be sure, some on the left are guilty of the same thing, but I don't think it's anywhere near to the same degree. And I've seen it firsthand through my mom's husband, Greg. He consumes media constantly, and it is never anything that challenges his worldview or political positions. And he's not alone. Fox News has significantly higher ratings than any of the other networks, and many of the top podcasts in the nation are from right-wing grifters and misinformation experts like Candace Owens and Steve Bannon and even Ted Cruz himself, which is amazing to me. Cannot believe people want to listen to Ted Cruz in their free time, but apparently they do. And then meanwhile, you have like the owner of the largest social media outlet in the world, uh, openly campaigning for Trump and spreading countless examples of misinformation on the website he's quickly running into the ground, and meanwhile, like trying to tamp down oppositional voices. Um, so you have all these things bubbling up. Look, I grew up in rural Northeast Texas. I love it, and it is my home. And many of the people here are genuinely good people. They love their families. They want to do right by their God. But many of them they're undereducated. They're frankly ignorant, and they are gullible. And when you combine that with a concerted misinformation campaign by some of the best quote unquote influencers in the business, you have a recipe for disaster. Now that's me speaking of where I grew up, but I think that you could replicate that in a lot of different places, these rural areas across the United States. And you really can't blame Kamala Harris for that. But this is the reality that any Democratic candidate in any election moving forward is going to be up against. And they have to be able to overcome this hurdle with their own strong messaging and policies that they believe in. And they have to be able to inspire the voters to believe that their policies will improve their lives. And kind of goes back to what I said in the previous point, where you got to keep harping on them, and you have to, um, really have the conviction of them, which I don't think that she had that either. So you have to have a combination of these things to overcome the hurdle of the misinformation that people on the right are kind of locked into, and she just didn't do enough to do that. Number four, we are going to be talking about the DNC's Democratic National Committee's failure to hold an open primary and their basically just appointment of Kamala to the position as candidate for president of the United States. You know what pisses off voters more than almost anything else is when they don't feel like they have a choice. But for the last decade, the DNC has done everything in its power to ensure that voters don't get to decide a damn thing. When Bernie Sanders was on his meteoric rise in 2016, which was bolstered by the hopes and enthusiasm of an entire generation, the DNC stacked the deck against him with super delegates. They conspired with the media to attack him, and they even were feeding debate questions to their beloved anointed Hillary Clinton. And then in 2020, when Bernie won the first several states of the primary, and he was kind of on track to win the whole thing, Barack Obama, there he was behind the scenes making calls to all of the people that were still in the race to drop out and endorse Joe Biden, like right before Super Tuesday, and they did. And that was enough for him to win the majority of those states. And at that point, he had all the momentum, and Bernie Sanders just couldn't combat that. And then in 2024, they took it a step further, where they enforced a media blackout on the few challengers that Biden had in their sham of a primary in 2024. And they even I call it a sham because they even went so far as to cancel primary voting in some states. I know Florida in particular, they just said, well, we're just not going to have a primary. We're just not going to allow the voters to vote whatsoever. And that's really what the DNC's whole position is they want to make sure that they can dictate the what happens with the Democratic Party and not allow the voters to do that. Now, I'm not going to be naive enough to say that for sure if there had been an actual open primary in 2024 that Democratic voters would not have voted for Joe Biden. They were gullible and willfully ignorant enough to vote for him the first time. So I'm sure that they would have been able to do it again. But when he was forced out of the race after that disastrous debate against Trump in July, the Democratic elites just immediately anointed Harris, whose campaign, like, remember, the Harris campaign in 2020 was so bad that she had to drop out 2 months before the first votes were even cast. Like she was out so fast because her campaign was that terrible. People weren't buying what she was selling because they didn't believe again in the courage of her convictions. And so when Democrats made the decision to anoint any candidate outside the will of the voters, much less one that they had already roundly rejected 4 years prior, they made a monumental mistake. And I understand that it was too late to hold a primary at that point. Obviously, the best case scenario would have been Biden just dropping out and not running for a second term, which is what he said that he was going to do whenever people voted for him for the first time. But the next best case scenario would have been for them to hold an open primary anyway, allow candidates to run against him openly, not silence them in the media, not cancel primary votes in various states, but to just have an open process. And if Biden was the best candidate, then he would have won. Or, if he was at least the ones that the Democratic voters decided, he would have won. Not sure that he would have been the best. But even beyond that step, so they didn't do any of those things. The next best thing would have been to hold an open convention after he dropped out, where the delegates that were there could have cast their votes and decided who they wanted to support. And between Biden dropping out and the convention, you could have had Democratic candidates coming out and making their cases before the delegates and publicly before the voters as well, and basically forcing each other to develop a real agenda to benefit the American people. That's what we saw in 2020, whenever the race was so large and you had Bernie Sanders, I think, was the leader and in dictating policy that you kind of had to support, or else you just weren't going to be able to hang. But I'm sure that there were some others that introduced some things along those lines as well. Like when you have a large number of people contributing ideas, then the result is probably going to be better than just one candidate who was just anointed coming up with whatever she wants. That's why we have a democracy instead of a dictatorship. But the Democrats didn't do any of that. They just anointed Kamala Harris. And, if you're a voter, why would you vote for someone that you didn't choose to vote for in the first place? And, the result is they didn't. Moving on now to number three, which just kind of goes hand in hand with that number four, is just Kamala Harris's association with Biden. So, as Biden himself would say, look, here's the deal. Uh, Joe Biden is not a popular president. He's clearly mentally unfit for the office. It's incredibly evident his cognitive decline over the last decade, and it's really sad. I mean, I remember my first semester in college. It was during the 2012 campaign. Obviously, he was Obama's running mate, and I remember the debate that he had with forget that guy's name, but whoever Romney's running mate was, Paul Ryan, I think, and like Biden was like if you go back and look at clips of that, it's amazing. Like Biden is so on top of it. He absolutely stomped Paul Ryan in that debate. It wasn't even close. And to see him then, which that was just 12 years ago, and then to see him now, it really is depressing. And I don't make light of anybody's cognitive decline. My both of my grandparents, who I love dearly, have suffered from dementia. One of them has passed away. The other one doesn't even remember who I am. So it's awful, awful thing that happens. I do not want to make light of that at all. But at the same time, I wouldn't have advocated for either of my grandparents to be the president with their cognitive decline. I just I don't think they would have been able to do a very good job, quite frankly. And I think that's how people felt about Biden as well. So yeah, there was the mental thing, but also, a lot of people's economic situations did worsen over the course of his presidency, even if he wasn't directly responsible for that. It all got off to a bad start in 2021 when he ran on raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, thanks to Bernie Sanders, and he vowed to give Americans a $2,000 stimulus check. Well, he waffled on both. He bafflingly downsized that stimulus check to $1,400 because he claimed, well, Trump already gave you a $600 check, so we're just paying the rest, which is, God, why would you give your opponent a win like that? Even if I mean, it's just so dumb, so dumb. And then Congress never even took up a vote to raise the minimum wage. It wasn't even on the floor, so just a complete failure from his part on that. And then, he ran on implementing a public option in the US healthcare system. Never even mentioned it during his presidency, not once. And keep in mind, Democrats had control of both chambers of Congress. They had the House and they had the Senate during the first 2 years of Biden's presidency. They could have passed anything they wanted, but they didn't pass those bills because they were paid not to, and that's an issue that I'm going to get into a little bit later. But the bottom line is Biden failed to deliver on what he ran on. And at the same time, we had inflation thanks to corporate greed, robbing American people blind with stagnant wages and corporations recording record profits. And beyond these economic issues, you had Biden's devotion to foreign countries like Ukraine and especially Israel, both of which he authorized billions of dollars of government aid that could have been used to aid our own people who foot the bill for that aid in the first place through their taxes. And the support for Israel in particular, obviously we went into that earlier, but they're just slaughtering an entire group of people wantonly over the last year. It's unconscionable, and I believe that's going to be looked back on as Biden's probably single biggest failure, even if I think his economic failures probably mattered more to the American electorate, which makes sense. I mean, obviously but I don't think the majority of the American electorate is probably paying attention to what's going on in Gaza. They just are thinking about themselves and their families, and they want to support whoever's going to make their life better. And when they were presented with the option, they believed that Trump was going to do that for them. So yes, Biden would have lost. Obviously, we've established that. But how does that affect Harris? Well, not only was she his running mate, and thus she was linked to his policies. Obviously, she was in the administration for 4 years. When she was asked directly on the campaign trail what she would do differently, she couldn't come up with anything. It's amazing. As soon as we saw that clip from The View of Harris saying nothing comes to mind whenever she was asked what she would do differently from the Biden administration, or when she responded to Stephen Colbert on his show, he asked her, "How are you different from Biden and Trump?" And she said, "Well, I'm not Biden and I'm not Trump." I mean, as soon as we were seeing those clips, we all should have known it was over. I think the only reason that we didn't is because Trump's campaign was so bad. He's with they're eating the cats and the dogs, and he's a convicted felon. He tried to overthrow the last election. He's dealing with his own cognitive decline, and he's historically unpopular. I think because his campaign was so bad, we just thought, oh well, surely the American people aren't going to vote for him. But at the end of the day, Americans had to vote for someone. And when they were faced, between these two not great options, and when they were faced with, the darkness of the last 4 years, and they're kind of looking back on Trump's first term with rose-tinted glasses, even though that term was equally dark. But Americans aren't known for their memories or attention spans. They decided to go with who they thought was best positioned to make their lives better, and they decided that that was Donald Trump. All right, now we're getting into the big ones here. We got the two biggest contributing factors to the failure of the Kamala Harris campaign. And I do think they go hand in hand. So we're going to start with number two, which is her failure to push enough populist policies. So I mentioned earlier that she did have some okay policies, but let's dig into what she should have done here. In 2016, we talked to some about Bernie Sanders here. He put together a populist agenda that I think is still resonating with people today. And it was so popular that it's even partially been implemented with no federal legislation whatsoever. I think the best example of that is his push for a $15 minimum wage. Although the federal minimum wage has not been raised once since his 2016 campaign, which, as noted, is a pronounced failure on the part of the Biden administration, it is not uncommon to see companies in bidding wars for hourly workers, and they're like proudly proclaiming their minimum wages for starting workers. $12 to $15 is not unheard of where I live in Northeast Texas, but one of our most popular institutions is called Bucky's. They advertise wages upwards of 17, sometimes even higher than $20 an hour, depending on the starting role. And mind you, Bucky's is a gas station. Okay. So many of Sanders' priorities in 2016 remain popular today. I think the majority are probably even more popular. Americans still overwhelmingly hate the U.S. healthcare system. It is broken, and they support a move to universal healthcare, which is in line with every other major country on earth, as Bernie would say. Americans overwhelmingly think we should overturn Citizens United and get money out of politics. More on that in a bit. Americans want to finally move past trickle-down economics and start taxing corporations and billionaires like we did in our greatest periods of economic growth in the history of our country. And Americans overwhelmingly would like to send their children to college without crippling them with debt for decades. So running on these policies and these messages is what a winning strategy for Harris would have looked like. This is what she should have adopted. And she could have run these policies down Trump's throat, man. He was like coming at you. His ideas were like, it's the immigrants, and it's we need to, I'm gonna cut down our energy prices for 50% and within a year, and I'm gonna do it by drilling a bunch of oil and gas, which is more expensive than renewables. She should have been hammering them on this stuff, man. But um, instead she kind of had a few steps in the right direction with those policies that I mentioned earlier. But Americans are done with steps in the right direction. They're done with that. They want monumental change, and I think until Democrats are willing to offer that to them, they're likely to continue to struggle. And this is not some mystery. Like the polling is unbelievably clear, not just for the Democratic base, but for Americans as a whole. So why don't they give voters what they want? Well, that leads us to problem number one, which is money in politics, which has resulted in the economic anger from the working class. At the end of the day, I believe many Americans decide who they're going to vote for president based on how their lives have changed over the last 4 years. And it's very easy to do. It's very easy to ask yourself, is my life better than it was 4 years ago? And when food and housing is exponentially more expensive than it was 4 years ago, you got wages failing miserably to keep pace, while you got corporate CEOs recording record profits, that's going to lead to an electoral revolt. It just is. The biggest problem here is not just that it's happening, but it's that Democrats are actually paid not to solve these problems. And it's because of the disastrous Supreme Court decision of Citizens United, which determined that corporations are people, and the allowance of super PACs that can channel hundreds of millions of dark money dollars into electoral campaigns. Democrats are incentivized to work for the millionaires and the corporates that line their pockets rather than the typical American voter. Now, Republicans do this too, of course, but when there's only two options and one has been in power for the last 4 years, it's easy for voters to decide, well, the current party isn't working for me, so let's try our hands with the other guys. And the sad part is that the Democrats had the solution. They had Bernie Sanders, who refused to take corporate PAC money, and he was only funded by small dollar donations from real people. And if you look at where donations were coming from in the Democratic Party of 2020 or primary 2020, you can see this map that breaks it down like on the county level and it's like color coded, and you can't even see most of the other candidates because almost the entire country is blue. You had like some red for Beto in that race, and I think you had some. And I think Amy Klobuchar is from Minnesota, so she was cleaning house pretty good in Minnesota. And you had like Biden in Delaware, but basically everything else was just a sea of blue, which was Sanders' color in that map. And I just remember it like it was yesterday, seeing that for the first time, and you can still see it very easily today. Um, and it was universal across the entire country, where he was raising more from small dollar donations from than anyone else. That is enthusiasm. That's a candidate that's paid to work for the voters rather than the donors. And that was a candidate that was on pace to win on election day in 2016. You can go back and look at the polling. Sanders was up on Trump by more than 10 points. He would have crushed him. And Trump's political future would have been buried. And the world we live in today would be much different. And I would argue happier, healthier, and safer. But the Democrats refused to rise to that occasion, and instead they've chosen to back their own self-interests over the interests of all. And until they can find another candidate with the courage to run against Wall Street, corporations, and the billionaires, that strategy is going to continue to result in failure. And that is why it's my number one reason that Kamala Harris lost this campaign. So I just want to make a couple of closing statements here as we wind down this podcast. I just want to be clear. I'm not happy about what happened on November 6th. I'm disappointed, I'm sad, and I'm angry. Um, while I think the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016 was an embarrassment, and she absolutely deserved to lose that election, um, Kamala Harris's it obviously had its flaws, and we've discussed them here, but I did think it was much better than Clinton's was. And obviously, I thought it was much better than Trump's was. I think Trump was a shell of the 2016 version of himself in 2024. I think his campaign was terrible, but um, Kamala's, I think, wasn't good enough to overcome the anger that people are feeling economically, and they're blaming Joe Biden for that, and I think not unfairly, frankly. Um, you know, unlike Hillary Clinton, who I absolutely detest, I actually, sort of, despite myself, kind of liked Kamala Harris, and I really liked Tim Walz. I think I mentioned earlier, I think he's the best governor in the country. He's personable, he's charismatic, he's articulate, and I think he would be an excellent candidate moving forward, unshackled from the chains of this ill-conceived campaign. And meanwhile, Trump, I think he's an embarrassment, a criminal. I think he's a pervert, frankly, and is experiencing a clear cognitive decline as well, just like Biden is. And I'm sure that's only going to be more pronounced over the next 4 years. That acceptance speech on election night that he gave, it was just an embarrassment, far beyond, I think, even anything that we saw from Biden, even that debate disaster in July. I was just looking at that speech Trump gave, just the gibberish that he was talking about. It's unbelievable how pathetic that was. But at this point, it doesn't really matter. This is where we are. So we need to understand how things went wrong. And we need to be able to correct the mistakes that were made and come out better and stronger on the other side. That is the only way to handle a loss, because the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. That's the show. Thank you for listening. If you want to agree or disagree with my analysis, by all means, or if you have your own picks for why you think Kamala Harris lost and Trump won this election, I'd be very interested in reading about it. You can write into the podcast at controlledburns with an ES at gmail.com. I would be thrilled to read your thoughts and opinions on the air. If you enjoy the show, you want to hear more lists, most of which will probably be a little bit more lighthearted than this, but lists are fun, right? Anyway, please subscribe, follow, like, review, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, keep it warm.